how in the world do you do education in 2023? Because it's cheating has always been a thing. So it's not like all of a sudden in 2023, cheating is now enabled and rampant in education, because it's always been dealt with. But as I've always argued, digital changes things and changes the way that things break out. And I just want to share 2 slides, and then we'll open it up to some discussion. So no, I don't want to update my driver. Thank you very much. Let's see. And no, it's none of those PowerPoint Live. So let me do a window, and the one that I want is this one. All right, so you should hopefully see the technology breaks time and space. So this is actually a concept that we started working with, oh man, over a decade ago at ICT, and this was as we were trying to design training and learning systems for the military, and we were using AR and VR and gaming and narrative and then rudimentary agents, AI agents, so some natural language tools. We wanted to come up with a conceptual model that enabled us to think a little bit more broadly about this. So the one that we work through is this concept that what technology does, and this is not limited to digital technology, but technology breaks time and space. And what I mean by that is that humans live an analog continuous life, in that we're born, we live, we mark time in different ways, and then eventually we shed our mortal coil, and then what happens afterwards depends on what your belief system is. But it is at any one point in time, a physical person has to occupy a physical space at a physical point in time. And what technology has done over the ages, so for instance, the printing press took an oral tradition and made it durable, and it made it transportable. And so that meant that knowledge didn't need to be shared when people were physically co-located in real time, but that knowledge could actually move through time and space. So it broke what humans were used to for a continuous experience. So since Rand lives on the Matrix, and this actually long predated my coming to Rand, this quadrant sort of lays out, okay, you can have time and space, and it can either be continuous or it can be broken. And so that gives you a nice 2x2. And this is focused on mediums, communication mediums. But the idea is that the lower left is what humans grow up into, what we're born into. And then the other 3 quadrants are what happens when you break time. So for instance, when you record something, recording technology allowed humans to break time. And then when you break space, so the telegraph and then telephone and television and now the internet breaks space. And that broken space, you can still have continuous time. So what we're doing right now is what I would call, it's broken space, but it's continuous time. So right now we're in that lower right quadrant. And then up in the upper right, you have asynchronous mediums and asynchronous modes of communication. And so when you move along the x-axis, what you're doing is you're increasing distance between the entities that are communicating. And as you go up the y-axis, you're essentially increasing the latency of the communication. So this was a conceptual model that we really liked, and we would refer to when we started to think about designing some of our systems. So when we move into the educational space, this expands. I've expanded this to a 2x3, and again, you can go you can go way more granular these things, but I always like to try and make the simplest absolute possible model, and then we can dig into the goals. So in this case, I've broken education into two things. There's a learning phase and there's an assessment phase. And I realize that there's far more nuance and you can make more, but those sort of grant me a little bit of license here to say there are two buckets. You spend some time learning and then you spend some time assessment. So you, as an instructor, you have to think about how to facilitate learning and create assessment tools. And as a student, you know that those are two things that you're going to happen. So now taking the broken time and space, sort of compress that from 4 down to 3. So you have real-time face-to-face. So that is essentially the classroom, the classic classroom experience. Then you have real-time remote, and we saw a lot of that with COVID. And then you have asynchronous remote. And asynchronous remote has been around from an education standpoint for a long time. The mail order degree was the lower tech version of it, but distance learning has been a thing for decades and arguably many decades. So this is now what populates these matrices is not meant to be exhaustive at all, but is just some quick and dirty examples of, based on my experience having taught in a couple of different types of schools and some varying different situations, as well as individual teaching for music and whatnot. But they kind of, these are, again, broad buckets for things that we probably know as students and or teachers. So lecture for the learning phase, lectures, some folks, a colleague of mine at Claremont taught chemistry almost entirely through Socratic method. Mine was a mix of Socratic method and project-based and learning, but project-based has seen a lot more traction in the last couple decades. And then the classic assessment mechanisms in the classroom are oral exams and written exams. And then as you move again to now, we're increasing both distance and latency. In real-time remote, people are doing live lectures, people are doing project-based learning, and you can imagine doing assessment of real-time oral exams and real-time written exams as well. So that's kind of a proctored remote exam experience. And then at the far right, the asynchronous remote training, learning, and assessment, I think is now what we're starting. It's always been a struggle, but now in a world where we have capabilities like ChatGPT and Dolly, it starts to get very strange because, for instance, I routinely, when I was teaching organic chemistry and biochemistry, I almost always gave take-home unlimited time written exams. And to the extent that if I put on that exam, explain the Krebs cycle, it's been shown that a student can go to ChatGPT and get a very coherent chunk of prose on explaining the Krebs cycle. And so I'll just throw out there that so the broad question for us to discuss is this just situation normal and we have to do a minor modification of the way that we think about learning and teaching, or is generative AI now a significant sea change that we're going to have to think deeply about how we facilitate learning, and probably more importantly, what we think about as tools for assessment, or is it just a blip in the radar? And I've got a couple of examples that I can give for how things that I did in the past would actually get around generative AI, but I'll save those and sort of stop sharing, or I'll stop sharing so I can see things. But I'm curious what folks think about where we are in 2023. Mo.
Yeah, I'm actually playing with ChatGPT. It is a while that I'm using this, and for coding, when I have, instead of Google, basically it replaced Google and for me, and I'm using that. So, and I see it's like sometimes it's so hard for me to that I can imagine think that there's a human being interacting with me. It's like someone is well educated, and sometimes it gives very stupid and nonsense answers to my question. However, what I would say is like in 10, in 5, and 4, 5, 10 years, we can imagine that things are completely different. Even it gets rid of those nonsenses and makes to a level that it's so hard to like a super intelligent machine. And so, and then the question is, what's the purpose of education? And is that educational system how we want to, in that way, what is education? I mean, what's the point of education? What we want to teach, what we want to, and is that like memorization is the thing that we just give something and people bring something back to us, or it's a way of thinking? For me, as I would say, it's a way of thinking, and so in that sense, meaning like some of the essential skills we need as humans to think critically, innovatively, and those are the probably being creative and and at the same time having a critical thinking ability to distinguish between somehow these different thoughts, ideologies, and whatever. So in that way, I would say it's a disruptive, and it changes everything. And in the other way, it's not, because it's still humans can be creative. If we create something like that, I would say still humans are at least for the foreseeable future can be innovative, and can be critical of the systems, meaning like they are able to see flaws in the system. In that way, I would say if those are assume those are the things of educational system, it doesn't change that thing. But if we think it's memorization, it's just giving something back, of course it changes everything in that.
So I'm in violent agreement that I think we need to completely rethink what education, why we do education, what we do education, how we do with education, and why we're doing the things that we do. And I will point out that variations on generative AI, in some ways you can look back at the argument around calculators in the classroom. That was kind of foreshadowing, right? There were a lot of arguments about should calculators be allowed in math classes, and there were arguments on both sides of that. I can remember in the early 2000s at USC, there were arguments in the faculty senate about whether or not the internet, whether or not wireless should be shut off in the classrooms. There were cogent arguments on both sides for that. So yeah, I agree. And it looks like Dulani does. I'm going to call on Dulani in a second, but John has his hand up.
So sorry, that was actually an accident, but while I have the floor, I completely agree. You know, I worked on computer-based education back in the 70s at the University of Illinois on Plato system. These same debates were happening about technology, and then, as you say, calculators and internet and whatnot. So I think all of these tools, including AI, are actually tools, and students motivated to learn can learn using all of them. And students motivated to cheat will often be successful unless there's some sort of real-time, possibly remote oral discussion where it becomes pretty clear whether you know your stuff or not. So sorry for raising my hand.
No worries. But yeah, the Plato's, that's old school distance learning, or CBT as we used to call it back in the day. Dulani, do you want to come on and make your point? Because I think you're agreeing with Mo, and you also bring up the calculator dynamic.
I'm better at asking questions than answering them. So I think the questions are pretty plain. You know, what are we trying to get? And Mo said it pretty clearly. You know, what are we trying to get? And maybe we do need to rethink how we get there. And I really appreciate Mo bringing up the memorization example, because that used to be education. We used to make people memorize things, and they were being educated. Maybe we need to think a little bit more about what we want people to be able to do or get, and then see how the tools fit from there. You know, what tools can help people get there. Maybe the someone said, wait, I could find the quote, I suppose, but they were asking, so this is probably like someone with a PhD was just testing ChatGPT on like general relativity or something like that. And they had a nice discussion with this tool over general relativity, and felt like if they'd had this tool during graduate school, that they would have struggled a lot less, because they would have been able to get have that conversational insight that they weren't getting out of their typical educational setting. So maybe ChatGPT should be the teacher once we can make sure that it's not hallucinating and giving out BS answers all the time.
Yeah, I've been playing with ChatGPT, and I got asked, this was last year, I got asked, press asked me some questions about metaverse and IoT, and I answered the questions, and then I asked the same questions to ChatGPT, and ChatGPT and I had about 60% overlap. And nothing that ChatGPT said was wrong, actually. But what was interesting was ChatGPT missed some things that I missed, or missed some things that I got. But ChatGPT talked about some things that I missed that just were not on my radar. So for me, and to your point, it can be incredibly valuable as a tool to help sort of sanity check or to help get us going. But again, if we're in a world where memorization and writing a 5-paragraph essay on Heart of Darkness are our assessments, then it's no longer, it's just a tool to just do that. And if the tool does it better than the students, then why are we doing that? Zara, do you want to come on and talk about your point, because it's a really important one that goes across every technology?
Yeah, I won't be able to go on like video, but I could come on audio. So
Sure.
Similar to GPT-3, started out free, people played around with it, and as soon as they saw some value, they started like monetizing it, where you have to pay to actually run more complex things going on. Does OpenAI plan to do the same thing with ChatGPT-3, where it's you pay to use it? If that's the case, not all students would have access to learning with GPT or even using it, so there would be an equity issue in that space. So I think that's also something that needs to be thought about with OpenAI and what they want to do with the technology.
Yeah, and one of the monetization plays that a lot of us think is on the table is that, ChatGPT is a very generally trained algorithm, and the money is going to be in much more targeted training, so that you have bespoke algorithms that are really good in a certain area. But I could be wrong, because I was wrong about YouTube. But yeah, Gopal, do you want to talk about your points?
Sure. So whenever I think about these technologies, like ChatGPT is an interesting example of innovation in the AI space. But whenever I think of these technologies, I think from the side of application as well as the implication. As a developer, I think we should also promote new innovations, and an outright banning, or let us say, or outright protest might not always encourage new innovation. And like, for example, if new innovation like ChatGPT, is questioning the way we learn and the way we are assessing our knowledge, be it in the form of essays or examinations or whatever it might be. If it is questioning that, perhaps we should also be brave enough to revisit the way we are doing things. Just to go back in the history, like for example, even now, like in my country, a concept of open book exam is highly discouraged because it is thought that okay, if we allow students to do open book exams, then they are not learning anything because they're more inclined towards memorization of definitions, right? Rather than using it more critically or creatively. So I guess like it is also the time to revisit the way we do our assessments and the way we conduct our learnings. But having said that, I would also say that there is a lot more room that AI tools like that GPT might also promote other unwarranted consequences, like for example, promoting stereotypes, or let us say the very fact that AI forces us to think differently about the way we learn might also backfire in the way it might brainwash our thinking. Like for example, I was looking through some papers where they're already discussing they have certain evidences how ChatGPT might have already created a kind of political thinking. It has kind of affected the political thinking among students and things like that. So I think like we have to like keep on fine tuning the innovation and then think about how we can better use it for the way we want to use it. I would conclude by saying that I think the reason why ChatGPT or any other AI tools like DALL-E comes very forefront in the discussion in the it's visibly so because like earlier whenever there used to be any innovation, the early adopters after it is adopted by the early adopters, it takes certain time to diffuse in the population, largely because this innovation should be very complicated to understand for population to use. But AI tools like really makes it very simple to use it. Great, anyone can go and use it ChatGPT and then see like how it provides the responses. So it just takes away that complexity part and it just gives you a black box to experiment things with. So it is that danger, I guess, like we have to deal with, but we have to think collectively how best to address that.
So I think that's a general sort of emerging technology phenomenon where when emerging technology starts to hit, it's complicated only technically savvy or people who are early adopters who are willing to deal with the pain and struggle to get it to work are the ones that benefit from it. But then at some point it becomes easy and you don't have to know anything about it to use it, right? So cell phones, most people know nothing about what cellular radio frequency, the fact that actually your cell phone is a radio, and the way that the details of software and a chip and all of that, you don't need to know any of those details on how to use it, right? It's just easy. And I think AI, because AI has been designed to be human-like, right? That should end up being the easiest for people to leverage, but it will also be the blackest of boxes as well. With regards to how you deal, so remediation and how you think about education and teaching, I want to give two examples of things that I used to do when I was teaching chemistry that actually you would still be able to do even with ChatGPT. And it gets, Gopal, to your comment about the open book exam. So the reason that I liked open book exams was that I thought that it actually helped to do away with memorization because the students didn't have to memorize anything. They could go look it up in the book. But But what it did was it drove two things. They had to know where it was in the book, right? So that would lead them to have read the relevant things. And they also hopefully then needed to know how to apply what was in the book to whatever I was being asked. It may be that chemistry is a bit of a unicorn in this because that's what I was teaching. But that said, organic chemistry historically is a memorization course. That's not the way that I taught it, and increasingly it's not the way that organic chemistry is taught anymore. The joke is that organic chemistry is the class that turns pre-med students into pre-law students. And historically, the reason is it's a memorization class, and med school curriculums historically were the first 2 years are heavily based on memorization. So it was a decent predictor. But that said, the way that I learned organic, thankfully, and then the way I taught it was much more about understanding why reactions happen and then being able to understand first principles and synthesize knowledge. The other thing is, it is the assessment, at least for organic chemistry and for biochemistry and inorganic, less for general chemistry because that's basically a math course. It's structurally based. So you're drawing pictograms, and at this point, ChatGPT can't do that. It doesn't understand drawing chemical symbols. That's going to change, right? Because if you imagine DALL-E, which is the generative image algorithm, and then you imagine that crossing over with ChatGPT, and if you train it on drawing chemical symbols, clearly it will be able to read and write chemical symbols, but it can't do it right now. So diagramming is, what we talked about for decades about visual literacy. So being able to read and write with image, whether that's a diagram that's whether you're doing a flow chart, or you're diagramming a conceptual model, or you're doing imagery to try and get across a point. That's something that a tool like ChatGPT also can't really generate. So you still have a little bit of window to use that as an assessment tool. The other thing that I think maybe has a longer lifetime is every year when I was teaching biochemistry, one of the main concepts that we focus on is protein structure function relationships. And what it means is that structure and function are intimately related. So if you understand the structure, you can usually infer the function. And if you understand the function, you can kind of guess at the structure. And together you start to understand how biological molecules work and then how everything happens. Now, a classic way of assessing knowledge in a biochemistry class would be to say, for instance, I could say, explain the mechanism of a serine protease enzyme. ChatGPT can answer that question very well. In fact, more eloquently than most undergrad students would be able to do it. If I asked ChatGPT to draw the mechanism of action of a serine protease enzyme, it wouldn't be able to do it, but it will be able to do it in a year. And if you had your biochemistry textbook, you would be able to look up a serine protease, because it's one of the canonical enzymes. You'd be able to look it up and you'd be able to transcribe it on your exam, right? So that I never asked those types of questions. The type of question I would ask is, I would say, here is a reaction, chemical reaction. Design an enzyme to catalyze it. So it's a reaction that is not enzymatically. So there is no real example of this, right? So this is at its core, you're asking a student to synthesize knowledge, because they can, if they understand how proteins work and they understand mechanistic organic chemistry, they can answer that question. They can design an active site. They can design an enzyme to catalyze that. I don't see AI, that is a harder problem for AI to solve and something that it can't do right now. And I think we have a longer lead time for that. So those are my two examples. And in some ways, I think it's low-hanging fruit for chemistry because chemistry is a very visual, has its own sort of visual language, and this ability to design things. That said, I think synthesizing knowledge is something that every discipline strives to do. And so I see Carlos is on the call. Carlos and I were talking earlier because he's taught before, and he teaches econ, and I asked him, so are you worried about ChatGPT with the students? And we talked a little bit about how, and again, this sort of, if you ask a student to diagram an economic system or an economic concept, that's something that ChatGPT can't easily do at this point. Since I've been rambling, I want to just back through chat. So Delani, it looks like you started a thread there. So could you pop in and talk a little bit about what you brought up?
Yeah, it was kind of just I wanted to rephrase something that I said when I was on camera earlier. So it was really just that I think there's a lot of worry from instructors about students using these tools in their classroom, but I think we're missing the potentially broader point is, can these tools be the instructor?
Yep.
And that's kind of what I was saying when that person said they wanted to, they were learning general relativity from one of these things. So that's all I was trying to say. And it looks like we've just continued, that once you have them, they can be, infinitely patient. They can be tailored to your learning style. My daughter has this system. I don't know what the name of the system is, but she's learning math, and she can go to any one of 3 or 4 types of recorded videos on any one topic. And so she might say, oh, I really like instructor 1, so I'm going to keep looking at their videos. But then when she gets to the point where it's like, well, I didn't understand how instructor 1 taught that. Let me see how instructor 2 or 3 taught it. And she can just drop down to each one of those. You can imagine an extremely tailored system that would know what your learning style is, what works well for you, and then just is almost like a tailored instructor. And then you'd have to have, maybe it wouldn't have to have, you might have a human instructor behind the scenes kind of monitoring, pulling the strings of all this stuff. And maybe you wouldn't, I don't know. But we're thinking about, human instructor and ChatGPT, taking the place of the student, but maybe we should be looking at ChatGPT taking the place of the instructor.
Yeah, so we started having these discussions back in the 90s. And so there, you bring up a couple of different points that I want to just put some language or some tags on them. So one of them is personalized education or adaptive. We call adaptive training or adaptive education, right? That's where you design a system. And John, I'll put you on the spot. When you were doing stuff with Plato, wasn't that one of the goals, was to do adaptive learning?
Yes, absolutely. So, the instructor, or so-called authors, the person creating the computer-based education materials, would have branches and of logic that would adapt to the student. So maybe you do more exercises if you do them not so well. I mean, you could see the same thing with something like Duolingo. The more you get wrong, the more you repeat until you get it right. And so that was definitely used. So that's why I think a lot of these things are either self-learning, can be self-learning tools, not cheating tools, but also I really like the idea of empowering students to learn on their own. And maybe that's because that's how I learn. Mostly, if I learn a new programming language, well, I start with a blank piece of paper and go. That's that. I think these kinds of AI systems can be well suited to those kinds of learning modalities.
So we made the argument, this again, starting in the 90s when we were doing, this was when the internet hit and we started doing, one of the reasons I changed I left my faculty position in chemistry was I thought the internet was going to be kind of important for learning. Turns out I got part of that right, at least. But we really started to, we were talking about, okay, we need to rethink what the classroom experience is, because if I can, you know, the idea of that a faculty member was doing information push, there are way more efficient ways to push information than having the sage on a stage model. So whether it's multiple video lectures, whether it's CBT modules, whatever that is, that's not a particularly efficient modality for disseminating information. So then we came back to, okay, well, what is the classroom experience really about? And then that led us to deeper dives in what is school really about. And I always defaulted to the number one function, particularly for K through 12, but I think also for higher ed, is it's socialization. It's humans, in the case of K through 12, it's young humans learning how to interact with each other, learning how to deal and struggle with things. And the fact that they're learning how reading, writing, and arithmetic, it to me is almost a secondary thing, that it really, the socialization is about it. Because frankly, especially now with gaming being so prevalent, with now YouTube being probably the best university, and Gopal noted in India, WhatsApp is referred to as WhatsApp University. There are so many ways for people to acquire knowledge and skills that may be accurate, maybe not. That's kind of a different topic. That this idea of, now, I still think that the classroom experience, that the real-time experience is important because the socialization is important, but that means that you really need to rethink what is going on in the classroom and what you're doing. And the language that usually gets talked about is, that's why project-based learning started to get a lot of traction in the education space. People started thinking about teachers as being facilitators as opposed to being pontificators. So I agree that this is the discussion about education needing to change and rethinking that has been going on for a long time. The current K through 12 model was designed to train people to work in factories. And it's going to be all robots working in factories. So clearly that the impetus for that design has come and gone. But because educational institutions tend to be like very large ships, they don't turn very quickly. But maybe generative AI is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back in getting us to really think about, fundamentally rethink what we want people to be learning and the role education learns. And oh, by the way, lifelong learning is critical, because whatever content I teach you now may be irrelevant 5 years from now. This is especially true in the emerging technology space, but it turns out problem solving is actually something that has a very long lifetime if you learn how to break down a problem and then solve it. Tim, I saw your hand up. I don't know if I just rambled too long to make you bring it down. But
No, I think most of what I was going to say was covered. It's just your earlier point about, well, maybe indirectly, that these kinds of applications for AI perhaps compete with teachers in a good way, and in that example kind of force you to assess or teach synthesis more effectively, because that can't be, becomes harder to cheat with AI. So I think, so it's interesting to look at it in that context, of not just replacing the teacher, but incentivizing teachers to perhaps up their game. That's it.
So Tim, you come out of engineering. So I come out of chemistry and music, which is a whole other thing and has its own problems. But out of engineering, surely you saw a broad spectrum of of classes and learning where some faculty, in some classes, they wanted you to memorize a bunch of stuff. And in other things, they wanted you to learn some tools and then apply them. And then in other classes, they wanted you to synthesize knowledge. Or did it tend to, I guess, what did your experience with education in engineering look like along those lines?
Personally, I think I was right on the cusp where rote memorization was becoming less important. So I did have some classes where you weren't allowed to bring a calculator in, but for the most part, that wasn't the case, at least for me. Maybe that's just more a reflection of age than anything. And I was also, I think, at a point where you were just starting to see more project-oriented courses, where there was increasingly a focus on design, on synthesis, and team activities in that regard. Again, maybe more of a reflection of age. But you nonetheless still did, as I think about this, just in reaction to your question, that you still had this separation between analysis and synthesis. But I don't remember there being a lot of necessarily rote memorization. And that was one regret, I must say, and then this is just personal perspective. I knew mostly a lot of older engineers who could solve problems on the fly. I was a pretty creative thinker and could come up with new ideas on the fly. But to do complex calculations, even back of the napkin in their head, I felt a little unarmed because I just didn't remember the details. Give me a chance to go look it up, but do it on the fly, I can't do that. So I think there is some value in having some level of memorization. That shouldn't be the focus, though. I'm not sure I answered your question, but those are my immediate thoughts.
So we have a diverse background of students. So I wonder if anyone coming out of more social sciences has any thoughts about the sort of reflecting on your education and the what you've seen, thoughts about the sort of memorization versus conceptual versus project, and whether, I'm wondering whether or not it becomes highly discipline specific about how you rethink about education and teaching. Keller.
Yeah, so I actually had a somewhat unusual education. The Oxbridge style is that instead of having like classes that really matter and lectures that are particularly important, like there were lectures, but if you skipped them, no one cared. The important part was that you had to write 2 essays a week, and that essay would get ripped apart. One of those would get ripped apart by your tutor in an hour-long session, and you had to defend what you had written, and if you had done a bad job, it would be humiliating. A couple of times, they would mock you. And that was really effective, that one-on-one tutoring experience contrasted to what I saw available elsewhere. So I'm definitely a big proponent of the more you can actually get feedback on what students have done and the more detailed work you can make there, the better off you are. I think that is sometimes underappreciated, that it's not a sort of new modality so much as opening up private tutoring for everyone. And so if we want to understand what the long run impact of that looks like, my expectation is that it's going to be less, we have a totally new and unprecedented style of education, and more everyone who is previously using private tutors, now that style goes everywhere. So to understand what the future will look like, just look to what the rich people are doing today.
Right. So, I mean, what you describe, I would refer to as critique-based education, and I'm a big fan of that. Tech and Society is designed to be critique-based, and it varying how well we pull that off all the time. But my wife is an artist and teaches at Cal Arts, and all of her classes are critique-based, and so it really is about a student making something, and then I mean, I try and be a little kinder and gentler, as opposed to ripping something apart in critique. Although, speaking from my past, I remember I got an organic, and I loved my organic professor. She was my mentor as an undergrad and was just an amazing woman. But on one of my exams, I got it back, and in big red ink, she wrote over an answer that I gave that was just complete nonsense. She wrote, "This is science, not science fiction." So your Oxford colleagues would probably have approved of that critique coming back. Graham.
Yeah, I think I'm actually probably going to, I think just from my experience at UCSD in political science, I will probably end up disagreeing a little bit with Keller, just because my UCSD is a very large school, and I think that in the political science department, I've definitely seen like just chat written essays that could rival like most of the essays you see, because I think a lot of educational standards in that field ended up being kind of low for a lot of classes. So then the question that for me becomes like, oh, does that mean that it just ends up that these standards get raised and you're able to sort of use this AI in a way that it can be this critique, this sort of tearing apart that you see in the Oxbridge model? Or is it just that's sort of it now, right? Like you don't necessarily, since a lot of these, at least in my assessment, a lot of my fellow political science majors were sort of just there for degrees, and maybe that's just sort of the end of things for them. It's just like, okay, now you can just use these AI to even more streamline writing essays that are perhaps not the strongest analysis. So I can kind of see it being a deleterious effect, but maybe not one that's the worst thing, just because some of the educational standards, just that a lot of these schools that sort of just try and push a lot of majors through, at least compared to on the chemistry side, where I thought they were more trying to get people to learn new skills and new talents. It could be bad, but overall, it's more of a system. The system was the problem rather than the new tool that helps game the system. But I'm willing to get some criticism there. So I want to probe a little bit on your difference between the chemistry and the political science, your experience. Just, do you think that it was more, because it sounds like you're saying that your chemistry experience, that it was they were a little bit more focused on trying to turn you into a scientist, mm-hmm. and that the political science program wasn't necessarily trying to turn you into political scientists, but trying to get you through the program? Or yeah, I think that, again, I don't know.
Is that a class size? Were the class sizes massively different? Was that part of the driver? Or
no, I would imagine it actually ended up, I think, I don't know if it was just, maybe I'm misremembering it, but I felt like it was pretty similar, where you'd have a lot of those core classes being like a 100-person lecture between both political science and chemistry. And then as you got into smaller classes, you would start to see difference. I do think there were definitely some of the more niche upper division electives where you would start to see, oh no, like let me actually teach you about a subject, teach you about developing certain skills and security studies and the like. But no, I don't know that it was a function of class size. I just think that it really was just a difference in the goals of some of these institutions, or the departments, I guess, not the institution itself.
So I'm curious whether or not the goals of the institution, though, reflect the goals of the students. Mm-hmm. And if you have, because there's got to be more political science majors than chemistry majors, I would think. But
I think it was just much more fractionated. There was people who might have been interested in political science could go different ways. Like you could do the sociology route, you could do the law route. So like maybe in aggregate, the different departments had different things, but just again, my perception of UCSD political science was that they were similar size. But again, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. That was years ago.
Yeah, I mean, for chemistry, in my experience, the students are there for two reasons. In my case, where I was teaching, it was mostly they were pre-med, so their goal was to get into medical school. The other percentage was they were interested in chemistry, but average college student who didn't quite know what they wanted to do and wasn't hugely driven, and they weren't going to pick chemistry just right as a major. So political science, I think, has a much broader draw for the students, and because they can go do more different things than chemistry. But I was hoping Angel would come on because I know she's a previous generation UCSD poli-sci. So
yeah, it seemed like making myself available for that part, but it actually goes a little differently, and it's a point I think, Todd, you made very early in the session, and that I think John made a comment toward, which is it's kind of a question of the pedagogy and the assignments the faculty do as well. So if you assign the same paper every year and it's really just explain the causes of World War I, it's so easy to cheat on that. You don't need an AI system. You just need last year's exam. So the point that we always gave for faculty training, and that we heard at San Diego or UBC or anywhere else, is you want to be bespoke. You want to be as specific such that you're answering what matters in that class in a way where you have to think through and demonstrate how you got there, rather than simply just knowing the answer to where the assignment came out, which actually is a better pedagogical one too. But I don't think it's the ChatGPT that gets to that, or and I know the assignments you did at UCSD. A lot of them really do look the same every year, and it's a baby research paper for which people are only taking from a few different sources anyway, which is about as easy as it's going to get for this sort of AI generated content, I think. So I'll own that one for my field, and the way in which we don't always strategically help learning models.
So I think one of the things that is integral to critique, and one of the things that I really like about it, is critique really is a dialogue between student and faculty. And what critique is about is not about a student presenting what they did. It's about a student talking about why they made design choices, or talking about why they did what they did, right? And I think to the extent that we right now, that's one of the criticisms of AI, is we don't know how AI came to its conclusion. So there is no explainable AI. The algorithm is a black box. So to that extent, if the process is that you're getting a student gets an assignment, and then their goal is to present that work and articulate, this is why my wife calls one of her main classes articulate how they came to these conclusions, what their process was essentially. That's something that I'm not clear that ChatGPT can do very well, or AI can do very well at this point. So I think, maybe critique is one of our silver bullets. It's not the silver bullet, but it's one of them. Real-time oral exams will be great until AR goggles become really good, because then you'll be able to get a visual teleprompter. And then Microsoft released their natural language. They'll generate a chatbot based on your voice. So soon you'll be able to, somebody will ask you a question, and then your bot will answer in your voice, and you won't even have to open your mouth. So brave new world. We're almost at the top of the hour. Zahn, go ahead.
I think Oshunde had his hand up first.
Oh, Oshunde.
Hello. Yeah. No, just I'll make this quick. Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting, I don't necessarily think it's important for us to understand how ChatGPT or whatever future iteration of ChatGPT, understand how it actually comes to its answers. I think it's maybe more useful to think of it in terms of you have a tool for generating a lot of concepts, a lot of ideas. And the role of education is, first of all, helping students understand what a good idea is, being able to discriminate on that. And so I don't necessarily think of it as a bad thing if the student uses ChatGPT every day, as long as in the course of learning with the instructor, they learn how to discriminate between what's a good idea and what's a bad idea. That makes for better practitioners and better researchers. So on the research side, I think it's actually a really, really good thing. Yeah, I'm just going to stop there.
Cool. Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour, and I have a hard stop. So I want to thank everyone. This is I love this topic. This is not the final word on this, because I think this is going to be a really interesting year in the educational space. I think ChatGPT is going to push the education industrial complex in ways that it hasn't been pushed before. So we may see a very different landscape coming soon. So thanks, everyone. 2 weeks from now, it looks like we'll be talking about how you calculate zero, and that'll be Zara and John Welburn. It has to do with net zero, so should be a fun session. So have a good one. Have a great weekend.